The morning Sarah Whitmore predicted the tornado 3 days before it tore through Abilene, Kansas. The cattlemen thought she had lost her mind, but the cowboy named James Holloway started loading his herd into the North Canyon anyway. It was April 1883, and the sky stretched clear and blue as a painted porcelain plate. Not a single cloud to suggest the violence she promised would arrive on Thursday at 2:30 in the afternoon. Sarah stood on the porch of her late father's ranch house, 22 years old with her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn jaw, watching James drive his cattle toward higher ground while the other ranchers laughed and went about their business as usual. She had been making weather predictions since she was 16. Ever since the fever that nearly killed her left her with headaches that came in patterns, she learned to read like other folks read newspapers. The fever had lasted 3 weeks, and when it finally broke, Sarah woke to find the world had changed around her, or perhaps she had changed in relation to it. Her bones ached before storms. Her temples throbbed in spiraling patterns that matched the rotation of approaching weather systems. The pressure behind her eyes told her when rain would fall, and a strange metallic taste on her tongue warned of lightning strikes. At first, she thought she was dying, that the fever had damaged something in her brain that would never heal properly. Her father, Benjamin Whitmore, had been a practical man who kept detailed records of everything on his ranch, and he suggested she start writing down what she felt, and when she felt it, then compare those notes to the weather that followed. After 6 months of careful documentation, the patterns became undeniable. Sarah could predict weather changes with an accuracy that made the farmer's almanac look like guesswork. When her father died the previous winter, thrown from his horse during an ice storm that Sarah had warned him about, she inherited the ranch and the burden of running it alone. The neighboring ranchers treated her predictions with the same dismissive tolerance. They showed most things women said about matters they considered masculine territory. All of them, except James Holloway, who had ridden for her father for 3 years and stayed on after his death, not because he needed the work but because something about Sarah's certainty made him believe in things he could not explain. James was 26, tall and lean with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water, green with flecks of brown. He had come to Kansas from Tennessee after the war, too young to have fought but old enough to have lost everything to it. His family's farm had been burned, his parents dead from illness. His younger sister married off to a carpetbagger who took her to Chicago. He drifted west like so many others, looking for something he could not name, and found work on the Whitmore ranch through a combination of skill and timing. Benjamin Whitmore had needed a hand who understood horses, and James had grown up breeding them. The old man recognized quality when he saw it, both in livestock and in people, and he paid James fair wages and treated him with respect. When Benjamin died, James attended the funeral and told Sarah he would stay on as long as she needed him, which she understood meant as long as she could afford to pay him. "You really think it is coming?" James asked that Monday morning, standing beside her on the porch with his hat in his hands, sweat already darkening his shirt collar though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. "Thursday afternoon," Sarah said. 2:30, maybe closer to 3. "It will come from the southwest, and it will be big enough to level everything in a quarter-mile path. We need to get the livestock into the canyon and board up the windows. We have 3 days." James studied her face, reading the tension around her eyes, the way she held her left hand against her temple. "Your head hurting, like someone is driving nails through my skull," she admitted. "Same as before the twister that hit Salina last year. Same as the one that destroyed that church in Ellsworth 2 years back. I can feel it building, James. This one is going to be terrible." He put his hat back on and nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Then we better get started. I will ride into town and hire some extra hands. We are going to need help moving everything." "Use the money in the tin behind the flour sacks," Sarah said. "And James, thank you for believing me." Something passed across his face, an expression too quick to name but warm enough to make her chest tighten. "Your word is the only thing I trust completely, Miss Whitmore. If you say there is a storm coming, then there is a storm coming." He left before she could respond, mounting his buckskin gelding and riding toward Abilene at a steady lope. Sarah watched until he disappeared into the heat shimmer on the horizon, then went inside to begin her own preparations. The ranch house was solid, built by her grandfather 30 years ago from thick limestone blocks quarried from the land itself. But the barn and outbuildings were wood frame construction that would not survive a direct hit from a major tornado. She started gathering everything valuable or irreplaceable, documents and photographs, her mother's wedding china, her father's journals, and carrying it all down into the root cellar beneath the kitchen. By the time James returned with 4 hired men, Sarah had worked herself into exhaustion. He found her in the cellar, sitting on a barrel of salted pork, her face pale and her hands shaking. Without a word, he climbed down the ladder and lifted her to her feet, his hands warm and steady on her arms. "You should have waited for help," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite anger but close to it. "I could not just sit and do nothing," Sarah said. "Every minute we waste is a minute we might need later. You will not be any use to anyone if you collapse before the storm even gets here." He guided her toward the ladder, his hand on the small of her back. "Go rest for an hour. We will handle the livestock." Sarah wanted to argue, but the throbbing in her head had intensified, and she knew he was right. She let him help her up the ladder and into the house, where she collapsed onto her father's old leather chair in the study and fell immediately into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The sun had moved across the sky, and shadows stretched long through the windows. James stood at the kitchen stove, cooking with the efficient movements of someone who had spent many nights feeding himself over campfires. He heard her approach and glanced back, his expression easing when he saw she looked steadier. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, sliding 2 fried eggs onto a plate beside the bacon. "We got most of the cattle into the canyon. The horses are secured in the limestone shelter on the north ridge. Tomorrow we will work on boarding up the buildings." Sarah sat at the kitchen table and accepted the plate he offered. "You sent the hired men home, told them to come back at dawn. No point paying them to stand around." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and sat across from her. "Some of the other ranchers saw us moving the herds. They wanted to know what we were doing. Let me guess, they thought we were crazy. More or less. Old man Patterson said you were hysterical from grief and I was a fool for indulging you." James took a long drink of coffee, his jaw tight. "I told him he was welcome to his opinion, and we would see who was standing come Friday morning." Sarah felt a rush of affection for this man who defended her to skeptical cowboys without hesitation. "You are risking your reputation on my word, James. If I am wrong, they will never let either of us forget it. You are not wrong." His certainty was absolute, unshakable. "Every time you have predicted weather, you have been right. Every single time. Those almanacs the farmers use, they are wrong more often than not. But you know things before they happen. I do not understand how, but I know it is real." "It sounds insane when you say it out loud," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe, but I have seen too much in this world to think I know all there is to know." He met her eyes across the table. "My grandmother back in Tennessee could tell when someone was going to die. She would see shadows on them," she said, "dark shapes that followed them around. 3 days before my grandfather died, she told him to make peace with his maker. He laughed at her, said he was healthy as a horse. Then he had a heart attack plowing the field. She knew things she should not have known, same as you. Some people are just born with gifts." Sarah had never heard him talk about his family before. He was a private man, careful with his words, and this glimpse into his past felt like a door opening between them. "Do you miss Tennessee?" "Sometimes. Mostly I miss who I was before the war took everything, but Kansas has been good to me. Your father was a good man, and this is good land." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. And the company has been better than I expected." Heat rose in Sarah's cheeks and she looked down at her plate. The attraction between them had been growing for months, unspoken but present, like the pressure before a storm. They both felt it, but neither had acknowledged it, held back by propriety and the difference in their positions. She was the ranch owner, he was the hired hand. She was educated, her father having sent her to a boarding school in St. Louis for 4 years. James had learned everything he knew from experience, working with his hands, sleeping under stars. The social gulf between them should have been unbridgeable, but somehow it felt like the least important thing in the world when he looked at her the way he was looking at her now. "James," she started, but he stood abruptly, carrying his empty plate to the wash basin. "You should rest more," he said, his back to her. "Big day tomorrow." The moment closed and Sarah felt its loss like a physical thing. She finished her meal in silence, then retreated to her bedroom, where she lay awake for hours listening to the wind pick up outside and feeling the pressure building behind her eyes. The storm was coming, right on schedule, and she knew with absolute certainty that it would be as devastating as she feared. Tuesday and Wednesday passed in a blur of frantic activity. They boarded windows, secured everything that could become a projectile, moved all the tools and tack into the limestone shelter with the horses. The hired hands worked without complaint, motivated by James's quiet authority and the extra wages Sarah paid them. By Wednesday evening, the ranch looked battened down for war, and the sky had begun to change. Clouds appeared on the southwestern horizon, tall and dark, stacking up like mountains. The air felt wrong, too still and too warm, pressing down with a weight that made breathing difficult. Sarah stood in the yard after the hired men left, watching those distant clouds with her arms wrapped around herself. The pain in her head had become constant, a drilling ache that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. James emerged from the barn and came to stand beside her, so close their shoulders almost touched. "Tomorrow," she said. "I know." He hesitated, then added, "We should both stay in the cellar when it comes. The house might not hold. My grandfather built this house to last 100 years. Your grandfather never saw a tornado like the one you are describing." James turned to face her fully. "Promise me you will go to the cellar when the time comes. I cannot lose you too, Sarah." The use of her first name, without the formal Miss Whitmore, sent a shiver through her despite the heat. "I promise. But you have to promise me the same thing. No heroics, no last-minute attempts to save property. We can rebuild buildings. I cannot rebuild you." His hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers rough and warm, and they stood like that until the first drops of rain began to fall, warm as blood and heavy as stones. Then they ran for the house together, laughing despite everything, and Sarah felt something break open inside her chest, something that had been locked away since her father died. Joy, she realized. She was feeling joy for the first time in months, standing in her kitchen dripping wet with James Holloway grinning at her like they had just stolen something precious. Thursday morning dawned gray and oppressive. The clouds had moved in overnight, a solid ceiling of dark green and purple that roiled like something alive. The wind gusted in strange directions, changing every few minutes, and the air smelled of copper and ozone. Sarah's headache had localized to a point just above her left eye, sharp and insistent, and she knew without checking a clock that they had maybe 5 hours before the tornado arrived. They spent the morning doing final checks, making sure the livestock had water, securing the last few loose items. At noon, Sarah prepared sandwiches neither of them had appetite for, and they sat in the kitchen eating mechanically while the wind howled outside. At 1:30, James opened the cellar door and lit the lanterns below. At 2 o'clock, Sarah walked through her house one last time, touching the walls her grandfather had built, the furniture her parents had chosen, saying goodbye in case she never saw it again. "Sarah." James stood at the cellar door, his face tight with worry. "It is time." She joined him, and together they descended into the earth. The cellar was cramped, barely 8 feet square, shelves lining 3 walls and the 4th opening to the dirt wall that backed into the hillside. It smelled of damp earth and preserves, of potatoes and apples stored for winter. James closed the door above them and secured the latch, then turned to find Sarah standing in the center of the small space, one hand pressed to her temple. "How long?" he asked. "Minutes. Maybe 10, maybe less." Her voice was strained. "It is right on top of us." They could hear it now, a sound like nothing else on earth, like a locomotive and a waterfall and 1,000 screaming voices all combined. The cellar door rattled on its hinges. Dust sifted down from the floorboards above. James pulled Sarah against him, wrapping his arms around her, shielding her body with his own as the world exploded into violence above them. The sound was indescribable. Sarah pressed her face against James's chest and felt him trembling, or maybe she was the one trembling, or maybe the whole earth was shaking apart. The door tore loose with a shriek of failing wood. The lanterns blew out. In the sudden darkness, something massive crashed overhead, a sound like the house itself being torn from its foundation. Sarah screamed and James held her tighter, his lips against her hair, saying something she could not hear over the roar. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The tornado moved on, taking its fury elsewhere, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like deafness. They stayed frozen for a long moment, neither willing to let go, both trying to process the fact that they were still alive. Finally, James pulled back enough to look at her face in the darkness. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, shaken. "No, you." "I am fine." His hands moved over her arms, her shoulders, checking for injuries by touch. "Stay here. Let me see what is left before you come up." He climbed the ladder carefully, testing each rung. Where the door had been, there was now open sky, the same sickly green color but lighter, the worst having passed. Sarah heard him pull himself up and out, heard his boots on what sounded like rubble, heard him swear softly. Then his face appeared in the opening above. "Come on up." Slow and careful. Sarah climbed toward the light, and when she emerged, she understood why his voice had sounded so strange. The house was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, gone. Where her grandfather's solid limestone structure had stood for 3 decades, there was now only the floor and part of one wall. Everything else had been scoured away, carried off by the tornado and deposited God knew where. The barn was matchsticks. The outbuildings had vanished. Trees that had stood for 50 years were stripped bare or uprooted entirely. "Oh God," Sarah whispered. James stood amid the wreckage, turning in a slow circle. "The canyon, we need to check on the cattle." They picked their way across what had been the yard, now littered with debris from their buildings and from places miles away. Sarah saw a child's doll, a wagon wheel, someone's family Bible spread open with its pages fluttering. They climbed the hill toward the north ridge, and from that vantage point, they could see the full scope of the destruction. The tornado had cut a path exactly as Sarah predicted, a 1/4 mile wide, carving through the landscape like God's own plow. 3 neighboring ranches had been hit. Smoke rose from what might have been the Patterson place. "The canyon is untouched," James said, pointing. "The cattle made it." He was right. The canyon was below the tornado's path, sheltered by the ridgeline, and Sarah could see the dark shapes of livestock moving peacefully in the protection of the limestone walls. The horses in the shelter on the ridge had also survived, and as they walked down to check on them, Sarah felt the pain in her head finally beginning to ease. The storm had passed. Her prediction had been accurate to within minutes, and James had trusted her completely. They found the horses nervous but unharmed. James spent an hour calming them while Sarah sat on a boulder and watched the sky clear, the ugly green fading to normal gray, the clouds breaking apart to reveal patches of blue. By late afternoon, the sun emerged, making the devastation somehow worse in bright light. They walked back to what remained of the ranch house and sat side by side on the limestone floor that had been the kitchen. "You saved my life," Sarah said. If you had not believed me, if you had not insisted on the cellar, I would have tried to ride it out upstairs. I would be dead." "You saved your own life," James corrected. "You knew it was coming. You prepared for it. I just listened to you, which is the smartest thing I have ever done." Sarah laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "I have no house. The barn is gone. Half my belongings are probably in Oklahoma by now, and somehow I am sitting here feeling grateful. Because you are alive. Because we are alive." James reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Sarah, I need to say something, and I am going to say it now while I still have the courage. I know I am just a hired hand. I know I have nothing to offer you except my labor and my loyalty. But these past months, working beside you, watching you run this ranch with more skill and intelligence than most men I have known, seeing you trust your own knowledge even when everyone else doubted you, I have fallen in love with you, completely, hopelessly. And nearly dying today has made me realize I do not want to waste any more time pretending I do not feel what I feel." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "James, I am the one with nothing to offer. I do not even have a house anymore. I do not care about houses. I care about you." He turned to face her fully, his green eyes intense. "If you do not feel the same way, if I am speaking out of turn, just tell me and we will never mention it again. But if there is any chance you might feel even a fraction of what I feel, I need to know." For answer, Sarah leaned forward and kissed him. It was clumsy and desperate and perfect, tasting of dust and fear and relief. James made a sound deep in his chest and pulled her closer, his hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I have been in love with you since last summer," Sarah confessed. "Since the day you convinced my father to let me come on the cattle drive to Dodge City. He did not think a woman should go, but you told him any rancher worth their salt needed to understand the whole process, and gender had nothing to do with competence. I fell in love with you right then, standing in the barn listening to you defend me." "We have wasted a lot of time," James said, and kissed her again. They sat in the ruins of her house as the sun set, making plans and promises, holding each other as the temperature dropped and the normal Kansas wind returned. Tomorrow they would deal with the aftermath, would help neighbors, would start the long process of rebuilding. But tonight, they had each other, and the knowledge that they had survived something terrible together, had come through the storm and found something worth keeping on the other side. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's prediction was validated beyond any doubt. The tornado she forecasted had been one of the worst in Kansas history, killing 17 people and destroying 4 ranches completely. The fact that the Whitmore ranch had lost only buildings and not lives became the talk of Abilene. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know how Sarah had known the storm was coming. Newspaper reporters came from as far as Topeka to interview her. Scientists from the university in Lawrence arrived with barometers and charts, trying to understand her methods. Sarah explained as best she could, showing them her journals of symptoms and corresponding weather patterns, demonstrating the correlation between what she felt and what eventually occurred. Some of the scientists were skeptical, calling it coincidence or lucky guessing. But others, the ones willing to think beyond conventional wisdom, recognized that Sarah had tapped into something real, some sensitivity to atmospheric pressure and electromagnetic changes that allowed her to feel storms coming the way some people could sense earthquakes. A professor named Dr. Robert Hayes from the university became particularly interested in Sarah's abilities. He was a young man, only 30, with wild hair and enthusiastic energy, and he saw in Sarah's predictions the possibility of saving countless lives. He proposed a partnership. Sarah would continue making her forecasts, and he would help her disseminate the information to farmers, ranchers, and town officials throughout Kansas. Together, they would create a warning system more reliable than any that currently existed. James was suspicious of Hayes at first, protective of Sarah and wary of anyone who might exploit her gift. But Sarah recognized the value in what the professor offered. She could help people, could prevent the kind of tragedy that had killed her father and so many others. She agreed to work with Hayes on the condition that any warnings issued would be free to the public, not hidden behind subscription fees or academic gatekeeping. Hayes agreed immediately, and they shook hands on the deal while James watched with his arms crossed and his jaw set. "I do not trust him," James said that evening as they sat by the campfire. They were living in a large tent while the new house was being constructed, cooking over open flames and sleeping under canvas like pioneers. "You do not have to trust him," Sarah said. "You just have to trust me." James poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night. "I do trust you, completely. It is him I worry about. Men like that, educated men from universities, they have a way of taking credit for other people's work. Then we will make sure credit stays where it belongs." Sarah moved closer to him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Besides, I have you to protect me from scheming professors," he smiled despite himself. "I suppose you do." His arm came around her, pulling her against his side. "When the house is finished, we should get married." It was not a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "Yes, we should. I am serious, Sarah. I want to do this properly. I want to marry you in a church with witnesses, want everyone to know you are mine and I am yours." "I am serious too," she said. "I would marry you tomorrow if we had a place to live that was not a tent." "The house will be finished by August," James said. "We could marry in September after the heat breaks but before the winter storms start." "September," Sarah agreed. "That gives us 3 months to plan and to let the gossips get used to the idea of the ranch owner marrying her hired hand." "Former hired hand," James corrected. "We are partners now, equal partners." That was true. In the aftermath of the tornado, Sarah had legally revised the ranch ownership to include James. It was partly practical. She needed his name on the documents to deal with certain business matters that men would not discuss with a woman alone. But it was mostly because she wanted him to know she saw him as an equal in every way. They would build the new ranch together, run it together, make all decisions together. Some of the older ranchers had been scandalized, but Sarah discovered she did not care what they thought. She had survived a tornado through her own foresight and James's trust. She had proven herself more capable than any of them. Their opinions held no power over her anymore. Dr. Hayes proved more helpful than James expected. He arranged for Sarah's weather predictions to be printed in newspapers across Kansas, credited clearly to Miss Sarah Whitmore of Abilene. Farmers began planning their harvests around her forecasts. Ranchers adjusted their cattle drives to avoid storms she predicted. The town of Salina evacuated its low-lying areas based on her warning of a flash flood, and when the flood came exactly as she described, drowning the main street under 6 feet of water, Sarah became something close to famous. With fame came complications. Men began showing up at the ranch uninvited, some wanting to court Sarah despite her clear attachment to James, others wanting to exploit her gift for profit. James handled most of them with quiet menace, standing in their path with his hand resting on his revolver until they remembered their manners and left. One particularly persistent suitor, a banker from Topeka named Eldridge, refused to take no for an answer and kept returning with increasingly expensive gifts. "I can offer you a life of comfort," Eldridge said on his 3rd visit, standing in front of the half-built house with a velvet box in his hands. "A mansion in the city, servants, fine clothes, society. What can a cowboy give you except hard work and calluses?" Sarah, who was wearing work pants and had plaster dust in her hair from helping lay the interior walls, looked at him with something close to pity. "He gives me respect. He gives me partnership. He gives me love that does not come with conditions or expectations. Now please leave my property before I shoot you myself." Eldridge sputtered, offended and incredulous. James appeared from the barn, carrying a hammer and looking dangerous. The banker retreated to his fancy carriage and never returned. That evening, Sarah told James about the encounter while they ate dinner by the fire. "You would not really have shot him," James said, amused. "I might have. I was seriously considering it." Sarah grinned. "Can you imagine Sarah Whitmore, whether prophet and suitor-shooter? They would write dime novels about me." "They probably will anyway," James said. "The weather prophet part, at least. You are becoming a legend, Sarah. People are calling you the Storm Witch." Sarah made a face. "I hate that name. It makes me sound like I cause the storms instead of just predicting them." "What would you rather be called?" "Nothing. I would rather just be Sarah, making forecasts and living my life." She set down her plate and moved to sit beside him, tucking herself under his arm in the way that had become habit. "Do you ever regret it, tying yourself to someone who attracts this much attention?" "Never." James kissed the top of her head. "I am proud of you. I am proud to stand beside you. And if I have to scare off a few fancy bankers to do it, well, that is just entertainment." The house was completed in late August, 2 weeks ahead of schedule. It was smaller than the original, built from a combination of limestone and timber. But it was solid and well-constructed, with large windows that let in plenty of light and a deep porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Sarah loved it immediately, loved that she and James had designed it together, had worked alongside the builders, had made choices as partners. They were married on September 15, 1883, in the small church in Abilene. Sarah wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk that she had ordered from a catalog, with wildflowers in her hair that James had picked that morning. James wore new clothes for the first time in years, dark trousers and a white shirt, his hair trimmed and his face freshly shaved. Dr. Hayes attended, along with the ranch hands, several neighboring families who had forgiven Sarah for being right about the tornado, and a surprising number of farmers who credited her forecasts with saving their crops. The ceremony was brief and heartfelt. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, there was a long silence, and Sarah found herself holding her breath. But no one spoke. James slid a simple gold band onto her finger, and she did the same for him. And when the preacher pronounced them married, the entire church erupted in applause. They kissed while the congregation cheered, and Sarah felt tears on her cheeks, happy tears, relieved tears. Tears of gratitude for this man who had believed in her when no one else would. The reception was held at the ranch, tables set up in the yard, food provided by neighbors in the tradition of prairie communities who took care of their own. Someone produced a fiddle, someone else a guitar, and soon there was dancing. Sarah danced with James until her feet hurt, then danced some more, giddy with joy and possibility. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, she found herself standing at the edge of the celebration, watching her new husband laugh at something one of the ranch hands was saying, and she felt such overwhelming love, she thought her chest might burst from it. Dr. Hayes approached with a glass of lemonade. "Congratulations, Mrs. Holloway." "Thank you, Dr. Hayes." The name still felt strange but good. "Mrs. Holloway." "Sarah Holloway, I have a proposal for you," Hayes said. "The university wants to fund a formal weather station here at your ranch. Nothing intrusive, just instruments to measure temperature, pressure, humidity, wind speed. The data would supplement your predictions, give us a more complete picture of what is happening atmospherically. We would compensate you, of course." Sarah considered this. "Would I maintain control of my forecasts? Would they remain free to the public?" "Absolutely. The university just wants to support your work, not own it." Hayes pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "You are doing something revolutionary, Mrs. Holloway. You are proving that systematic weather prediction is possible. This could change how we think about meteorology." "Let me discuss it with my husband," Sarah said. "We make decisions together now." Hayes smiled. "Of course, take your time." When Sarah told James about the proposal later that night, alone finally in their new house, in the bedroom they would share for the first time as husband and wife, he listened carefully before responding. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I think it could be useful. Better data might help me refine my predictions. understand the patterns more completely. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, nervous in a way she had not expected. They had kissed many times, had held each other through storms literal and metaphorical, but this was different. This was their wedding night, and suddenly she felt shy. James knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "Then we will do it. We will turn this ranch into the most advanced weather station in Kansas." He paused. "But right now, I do not want to talk about weather or universities or anything except the fact that you are my wife and I am your husband, and we have the rest of our lives starting tonight." He kissed her gently, giving her time to respond, to pull away if she wanted. But Sarah did not want to pull away. She kissed him back, her hands moving to his shoulders, then to his hair, pulling him closer. They took their time, learning each other slowly, carefully, with tenderness and patience and an overwhelming sense of rightness. When they finally lay together in the darkness, Sarah pressed against James's side with his arm around her. She felt more complete than she had ever felt in her life. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," James said. "More than I thought it was possible to love another person." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, safe in their new house on the Kansas prairie. The weather station was installed over the following month, a collection of instruments mounted on a tall pole in the yard and a rain gauge positioned away from the buildings. Dr. Hayes trained Sarah in how to take readings, how to record data in standardized formats. She discovered she enjoyed the scientific aspect of her work, liked seeing the numbers confirm what her body was telling her. The combination of her physical sensitivity and the instrumental data made her predictions even more accurate. By November, Sarah's forecasts were being published in newspapers across 3 states. She predicted a severe ice storm that would hit Kansas and Missouri in early December, giving a 10-day warning that allowed farmers to prepare and cities to stock supplies. When the storm arrived exactly as she described, coating everything in 3 inches of ice and bringing transportation to a halt, the governor of Kansas sent her a personal letter of thanks. Sarah framed it and hung it in the parlor, amused and slightly embarrassed by the official recognition. James took the fame in stride, proud but protective. He ran the ranch efficiently, managing the cattle and horses, hiring and overseeing ranch hands, handling the business aspects while Sarah focused on her weather work. They were a formidable team, complementing each other's strengths, covering each other's weaknesses. The ranch prospered despite the previous year's devastation. They rebuilt better than before, stronger than before. In January 1884, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She knew before she missed her cycle, knew from a strange, fluttering sensation behind her navel that felt different from her weather sensitivities. When she told James, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, then immediately set her down and apologized, worried he had been too rough. Sarah laughed at his sudden carefulness, but she loved him for it too. The pregnancy was difficult in ways she had not anticipated. Her weather sensitivity intensified, the headaches becoming nearly unbearable before major storms. She could feel every atmospheric change with painful clarity, could predict not just when storms would arrive but their exact path, their wind speed, their potential for damage. It was as if the baby growing inside her had amplified her abilities, turned up the volume on a gift that was already overwhelming. Dr. Hayes was fascinated from a scientific perspective, though he tried to be tactful about it. He visited more frequently, taking detailed notes, trying to understand the connection between pregnancy and enhanced sensitivity. Sarah tolerated his interest because his research was helping people, but James grew increasingly frustrated with the professor's constant presence. "He treats you like an experiment," James said one evening after Hayes had finally left. "He treats me like a subject of study," Sarah corrected. "There is a difference, not much of one from where I am standing." James paced the parlor, agitated. "You are my wife carrying my child. You are not a scientific curiosity for some university professor to poke at." Sarah set down the sock she was darning. "James, come here." He came reluctantly, sitting beside her on the sofa. Sarah took his hand and placed it on her swollen belly. After a moment, the baby kicked, a strong, definite movement against his palm. James's expression softened immediately, all the frustration draining away. "That is our child," Sarah said quietly, "our future. And my ability to predict weather is part of who I am, part of what I bring to this partnership. Dr. Hayes's research might help other women like me, might help people understand that these gifts are real and valuable. I know it is intrusive sometimes, but I think it is important work." James was quiet for a long moment, his hand still on her belly, feeling the baby move. "You are right," he said finally. "I am sorry, I just get protective when I think someone might be taking advantage of you. I know, and I love you for it, but I need you to trust that I can handle Dr. Hayes, same as I handled the tornado, same as I handle everything else." "I do trust you," James said. He leaned over and kissed her, gentle and lingering. "I trust you completely." In April, Sarah predicted a series of severe thunderstorms that would bring heavy rain and potential flooding to eastern Kansas. She was 8 months pregnant, exhausted and uncomfortable, but she insisted on sending out detailed warnings to every newspaper that published her forecasts. The storms came exactly as predicted, 3 days of torrential rain that swelled rivers and washed out roads, but because of Sarah's warnings, no one died. Livestock had been moved to higher ground, families had evacuated low-lying areas, supplies had been stockpiled. The damage was extensive, but the loss of life was zero. The governor came to visit in person after the floodwaters receded, arriving at the ranch in an official carriage with an entourage of assistants and reporters. Sarah, hugely pregnant and wearing a dress that barely fit anymore, received him in the parlor while James stood behind her chair like a protective shadow. "Mrs. Holloway," the governor said, "you have saved countless lives with your predictions. The people of Kansas are deeply grateful." "I am just doing what I can to help," Sarah said, "same as anyone would. But you are not just anyone, you are extraordinary." The governor produced an official-looking document with a seal at the bottom. "On behalf of the state, I would like to offer you a position as official weather consultant to Kansas. You would receive a salary, governmental support for your work, and official recognition of your contributions. What do you say?" Sarah glanced back at James, who nodded slightly. She looked at the document, reading the terms carefully. The salary was generous. The support included funding for expanded instrumentation and an assistant to help with data collection and dissemination. Most importantly, the position would not restrict her freedom to work as she chose or require her to relocate to Topeka. "I accept," Sarah said, "on the condition that all my forecasts remain free to the public and that I maintain final authority over how my predictions are used." "Of course," the governor agreed immediately. He shook her hand and photographers took pictures, and suddenly Sarah was not just locally famous but officially important. After the governor left, she sat in the parlor feeling slightly dazed. "Official weather consultant to Kansas," James said, sitting beside her. "They should have made you official miracle worker." "It does not feel real," Sarah admitted. "A year and a half ago, people thought I was crazy. Now the governor is giving me a government position." "You proved them all wrong. You saved lives." James put his hand on her belly again, a gesture that had become reflexive. "You are amazing, Sarah. I knew it the first time I met you, and every day you prove it again." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, though that might have been the pregnancy hormones. "I could not have done any of this without you. You believed in me when no one else did. You stood beside me when everyone else thought I was insane. You are the reason I had the courage to trust myself." "We are the reason," James corrected. "We are partners. We do this together." They sat together in the fading afternoon light, holding hands, feeling their baby move beneath Sarah's skin, and Sarah thought about how much had changed since that clear blue morning when she predicted the tornado. She had lost her father's house but built her own. She had lost her anonymity but gained purpose. She had been alone and now she was loved. Everything had transformed, and it had all started with a cowboy who trusted her word over all else. Sarah went into labor on a clear May morning, 2 weeks earlier than expected but not dangerously so. James fetched the midwife from town while Sarah paced the house, breathing through contractions that felt like her body was being torn in half. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Brennan, who had delivered half the babies in Abilene, examined Sarah and pronounced everything normal and progressing well. "First babies take their time," Mrs. Brennan said. "Settle in, dear, this could be a long day." It was. The labor lasted 14 hours, brutal and exhausting, and there were moments when Sarah was certain she could not endure another second. But James never left her side, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, telling her she was strong enough to do this. And finally, as the sun was setting, their son was born, screaming and healthy, with a thick shock of dark hair and his father's green eyes. "A boy," Mrs. Brennan announced, placing the baby on Sarah's chest. "A big, healthy boy." Sarah looked down at her son, at this tiny person she and James had created, and felt a love so fierce it was almost frightening. James leaned over them both, his face wet with tears, his hand gentle on the baby's head. "He is perfect," James whispered. "You are both perfect." They named him Benjamin, after Sarah's father, with James as his middle name, Ben Holloway. He was a good baby, calm and observant, and from the beginning he seemed fascinated by the sky. When he was only a few weeks old, he would stare up at the clouds with intense focus, tracking their movement across the heavens. Sarah wondered if he had inherited her sensitivity, if he would grow up feeling storms in his bones the way she did. Motherhood changed Sarah's relationship with her gift. The enhanced sensitivity she had experienced during pregnancy faded somewhat after Ben was born, but it never returned to its previous levels. She could still predict weather with remarkable accuracy, but now she saw her forecasts through the lens of protecting her son, of keeping him safe from the dangers she could foresee. It made her more cautious in some ways, more insistent that people take her warnings seriously. Dr. Hayes continued his research, now interested in whether Ben showed any signs of weather sensitivity. Sarah allowed limited observation but put strict boundaries around her son's involvement. She would not let him be treated as an experiment, would not let his childhood be dominated by scientific interest. James supported her completely, and together they formed a united front against any intrusion they deemed excessive. Ben grew quickly, a bright, curious child who learned to walk at 10 months and talk in complete sentences by age 2. He followed his father everywhere, imitating his walk, trying to help with ranch work in ways that were more hindrance than help but endlessly endearing. James taught him to ride almost before he could run, sitting him on the gentlest mare and walking beside him around the corral. Sarah watched from the porch, her hand resting on her stomach where a second baby was already growing, due in the winter. The ranch continued to thrive. With Sarah's government salary and the income from their cattle sales, they were financially secure for the first time. James expanded the horse breeding operation, developing a reputation for quality stock that brought buyers from 3 states. Sarah continued making weather predictions that were published across the Midwest, her accuracy never diminishing, her fame growing steadily. In December 1885, during a blizzard that Sarah had predicted 5 days in advance, she gave birth to their daughter. The labor was shorter this time, only 6 hours, and the baby arrived squalling into a world of white snow and howling wind. They named her Rose after James's mother, and she had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn determination. Even as a newborn, she had opinions and she expressed them loudly. With 2 children, the ranch became busier and more chaotic. Ben was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to help care for her, bringing her things she was too young to appreciate. James balanced ranch work with fatherhood beautifully, somehow managing to be both the stern boss the ranch hands respected and the gentle father who sang lullabies to his children. Sarah divided her time between weather forecasting, motherhood, and ranch management. And though she was often exhausted, she was also deeply content. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and storms, of children growing and love deepening. Ben did develop weather sensitivity, though not as intense as Sarah's. He could feel major storms coming, got headaches before tornadoes, but he did not have the precision his mother possessed. Rose showed no sensitivity at all, but had an uncanny ability to predict when animals were sick or injured, some instinct that made her a natural healer. Both children grew up understanding that their gifts were normal, were simply part of who they were, and that made all the difference. Sarah's reputation continued to grow. By 1890, her weather forecasts were being published in newspapers across 7 states. The federal government, which had recently established the Weather Bureau, approached her about joining their organization. She declined, preferring to remain independent, but agreed to share her methods and data with their meteorologists. Some of them were skeptical of her abilities, insisting that scientific instruments were the only reliable means of forecasting. But others recognized that Sarah represented something valuable, a human sensitivity that complemented mechanical measurement. James, now in his early 30s, had grown into his role as ranch owner with quiet confidence. He was respected throughout the region, known for fair dealing, quality livestock, and an unusual partnership with his wife that made some people uncomfortable, but that no one could argue with given their obvious success. He and Sarah made all decisions together, managed finances jointly, and treated each other with a respect that was uncommon in marriages of that era. In the spring of 1892, when Ben was 8 and Rose was 6, a new challenge emerged. A wealthy land developer from Chicago named Cornelius Blackwell arrived in Abilene with plans to buy up ranches and divide the land into small farming plots to sell to immigrants. He offered generous prices, and several of the older ranchers, tired and childless, accepted his offers. Blackwell then approached the Holloway Ranch with an offer that was triple the land's actual value. "I will give you $300,000 for this property," Blackwell said, sitting in their parlor with a contract already prepared. "You could retire, move to a city, live comfortably for the rest of your lives. Your children could attend the finest schools. Why work yourselves to exhaustion on this harsh land when you could have luxury?" Sarah and James exchanged a look, one of those married couple communications that happened without words. James spoke first. "This land is not harsh, it is home. It is where my wife's grandfather built his house with his own hands, where her father ranched for 30 years, where we survived a tornado and built something new. It is where our children were born, and where they will grow up learning the value of honest work and connection to the land. Your money, Mr. Blackwell, cannot buy what this place means to us." Blackwell's expression hardened. "You are making a mistake. The world is changing. The open range is dying. In 20 years, this will all be farmland anyway. You might as well profit from the inevitable." "Then we will adapt," Sarah said. "We have adapted to everything else, but we will do it on our own terms on our own land. The answer is no." Blackwell left angry, and over the next few months he made their lives difficult in small ways. He bought up surrounding properties, interfered with water rights, tried to redirect the railroad spur that brought their cattle to market. But Sarah and James fought back, hiring lawyers when necessary, organizing the remaining ranchers to present a united front, using Sarah's fame and government position to apply political pressure. Eventually, Blackwell gave up and moved on to easier targets, leaving the Holloways and several other families still in possession of their land. The struggle brought Sarah and James even closer, reminded them that they were strongest when they faced challenges together. One evening after the children were in bed, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and James pulled Sarah close. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Choosing this life instead of something easier?" "Never," Sarah said without hesitation. This life is hard sometimes, but it is ours. We built it together. Our children are growing up strong and capable, connected to something real. How could I regret that? I worry that I have limited you. That if you had married someone with money and status, someone from your own class, you could have had more opportunities. Sarah turned to face him fully. James Holloway, you have given me everything that matters. You trusted me when no one else did. You stood beside me when everyone thought I was insane. You treat me as an equal partner in everything we do. You love me and our children with a constancy that never wavers. If that is limited, then I do not want unlimited. He kissed her then, deep and long, with the passion that had never faded despite years of marriage and the exhaustion of raising children and running a ranch. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Sarah laughed. We should probably go inside before we scandalize the ranch hands. Let them be scandalized, James said, but he stood and offered his hand. They went inside together, up to their bedroom, where they loved each other with the ease of long familiarity and the excitement that still sparked between them. The years continued their steady progression. Ben grew into a tall, serious boy who loved horses and had his father's patient way with animals. He could predict storms well enough to be useful, would tell his mother when he felt a headache coming on, and Sarah would check her instruments and find that, yes, a weather system was approaching. Rose became a whirlwind of energy, always moving, always talking, always bringing home injured birds or rabbits to heal. She had no interest in weather prediction but could diagnose a sick cow with uncanny accuracy. In 1895, when Sarah was 34 and James was 38, Dr. Hayes published a comprehensive study on weather sensitivity based on 20 years of working with Sarah. The paper appeared in scientific journals across the country and internationally, causing significant debate in the meteorological community. Some scientists dismissed the work as pseudoscience, but others took it seriously, began looking for other individuals with similar abilities. Hayes credited Sarah extensively, called her the most important weather forecaster of their generation, and suddenly she was not just famous but historically significant. Reporters came to interview her, wanting to know how she had developed her abilities, whether they could be taught, what she saw for the future of weather prediction. Sarah handled the attention with grace, always crediting James's support and Dr. Hayes's research, always emphasizing that she was simply doing what she could to help people. She was offered positions at universities, was invited to speak at conferences, was courted by institutions that wanted to study her methods. She declined most of these offers, preferring to remain at her ranch, living the life she had chosen. But she did travel occasionally, giving lectures in Kansas City and St. Louis, speaking to groups of farmers about how to interpret weather signs, teaching others to pay attention to their own physical responses to atmospheric changes. James usually accompanied her on these trips, leaving Ben and Rose with trusted ranch hands, and they used the travel as opportunities to be alone together, to remember who they were as a couple beyond parents and ranch owners. On one such trip to St. Louis in 1897, they visited the same boarding school Sarah had attended as a girl. Walking through the familiar halls, seeing the classrooms where she had learned mathematics and literature, Sarah felt the distance between who she had been and who she had become. That girl who studied here had been shaped by rules and expectations, had been taught to be quiet and proper, had never imagined she would spend her adult life predicting weather and running a ranch in partnership with a man who had been born poor. "What are you thinking?" James asked, watching her expression. "That I am glad I became this person instead of the person they tried to make me," Sarah said. That girl they were educating, she would have married someone appropriate and spent her life hosting teas and managing household staff. She would never have known what it felt like to ride out a tornado in a cellar with the man she loved. She would never have saved lives or made history. She would have been comfortable and respectable and utterly unfulfilled. "I am glad you became this person too," James said. Since this person is the one I love. They kissed in the empty corridor, and Sarah felt like she was claiming something, choosing her own path over the one that had been laid out for her. It was a small moment, meaningless to anyone but them, but it felt important. Back at the ranch, life continued its pattern. Ben turned 14 and began taking on more responsibility with the horses, showing a talent for training that exceeded even his father's. Rose at 12 was already talking about becoming a veterinarian, though everyone told her such a profession was not open to women. She informed them all that things would change by the time she was old enough, and Sarah believed her. Her daughter had inherited her own stubbornness, her refusal to accept limitations others tried to impose. In the summer of 1898, Sarah predicted a drought that would last 3 months and devastate crops across Kansas and Oklahoma. She issued warnings in June, telling farmers to harvest early if possible, to store water, to prepare for serious hardship. Many ignored her, saying the fields looked healthy and the sky looked fine. But those who had learned to trust her word took precautions, and when the rain stopped in July and did not return until October, the difference was stark. Farms that had prepared survived, those that had not faced ruin. The drought relief efforts brought Sarah back into close contact with state officials. The governor, a different man than the one who had appointed her years ago, asked her to advise on water management policies, to help predict when the drought would break. Sarah spent hours studying her instruments and her own bodily responses, feeling the bone-dry air and the high-pressure system that had settled over the region like a lid on a pot. She told the governor the drought would end in the first week of October, that a weather pattern shift would bring sustained rainfall, that they should prepare for potential flooding after the ground had been dry for so long. The rain came on October 3rd, exactly when Sarah predicted, and it continued for a week, turning roads to mud and swelling streams. But because of her warnings, towns had prepared drainage systems, farmers had reinforced their property, and the flooding was manageable rather than catastrophic. Once again, Sarah's predictions saved lives and property, and once again her reputation grew. James watched all of this with pride, but also with a protective concern that never diminished. He saw how the constant public attention exhausted Sarah, how the weight of responsibility, knowing that people's lives depended on her accuracy, sometimes crushed her. After particularly difficult predictions, he would find her sitting alone, staring at the sky, and he would simply sit beside her without speaking, offering his presence as comfort. "Sometimes I wish I did not know," Sarah confessed one evening. "I wish I could just see clouds and think they are pretty instead of seeing patterns and knowing what is coming." "But if you did not know, how many more people would die?" James asked gently. "How many families would lose everything because they had no warning?" "Your gift is hard to carry, but it matters, Sarah. It matters more than almost anything." "I know, but that does not make it easier." "No, but you do not have to carry it alone. I am here, I will always be here," and he was. Through every prediction, every success, every rare failure, every moment of doubt and exhaustion, James was there. He was her anchor, her steady place, the one person who saw all of her. The famous weather forecaster and the tired woman, the gifted predictor and the mother worried about her children, the strong ranch owner and the vulnerable human who sometimes needed to be held while she cried. As the century turned and the year became 1900, the Holloway family stood together at the edge of their land, watching the sunset on the last day of December. Ben was 16 now, nearly a man, tall and capable. Rose was 14, fierce and brilliant, already making plans to change the world. Sarah was 39, gray threading through her dark hair, lines around her eyes from years of squinting at the sky. James was 42, still strong, still steady, still looking at his wife like she was the most miraculous thing he had ever seen. "New century," Ben said. "Everything is going to change." "Some things will change," James agreed, But some things stay the same: the land, the sky, the work, family, love, those things are constant. Your father is getting philosophical in his old age, Sarah teased. I am not old, James protested. I am experienced. Rose laughed, and Sarah felt a wave of contentment so strong it was almost painful. This was her life. These people, this land, this love. She had predicted weather and saved lives and become famous, but none of that mattered as much as the four of them standing together watching the sun go down on one century and preparing to face the next. The new century brought new challenges. The automobile began appearing in larger towns, though they were still rare enough to spook horses. The telephone lines reached Abilene, and Sarah had one installed at the ranch so she could communicate her predictions more quickly to newspapers and government offices. The world was speeding up, modernizing, and the old ways of the frontier were disappearing, but some things remained timeless. Cattle still needed tending, horses still needed training, crops still depended on weather. And people still looked to the sky with worry and hope, wondering what was coming. Sarah continued making predictions, her accuracy never diminishing. She forecasted a massive blizzard in January 1901 that would have caught Kansas unprepared if not for her 10-day warning. She predicted a tornado outbreak in April 1902 that allowed 16 towns to implement shelter protocols that saved countless lives. She called a drought in 1903 and a flood in 1904, each prediction allowing people to prepare and adapt. Dr. Hayes, now in his late 40s, continued documenting her work, publishing papers that cemented her place in meteorological history. The Weather Bureau, despite initial skepticism, began incorporating some of her methods into their own forecasting. Sarah trained several young women who showed signs of weather sensitivity, helping them understand and trust their gifts the way James had helped her trust hers. Ben married in 1904, at age 20, to a rancher's daughter named Catherine who loved horses as much as he did. They built a house on the northern section of the Holloway property and started their own family, giving Sarah and James their first grandchild, a boy named James Benjamin, in 1905. Sarah held her grandson and saw her husband's face in miniature, saw the continuation of their love in this new generation, and felt the miracle of it. Rose shocked everyone by being accepted to veterinary school in 1906, one of only 3 women in her class. She faced discrimination and harassment, but she persevered, driven by the same stubborn determination that had carried her mother through skepticism and doubt. Sarah and James were enormously proud, though they missed her terribly when she was away studying. As Sarah entered her mid-40s, her weather sensitivity began to change again. The headaches lessened, but her predictive window expanded. She could feel weather patterns forming 2 weeks out, sometimes 3, could sense the shape of entire seasons before they arrived. In the spring of 1908, she correctly predicted that the summer would be the coolest in 20 years, allowing farmers to adjust their crop selections accordingly. In the fall of 1909, she forecasted a harsh winter with record snowfalls, and towns stocked supplies that saw them through months of brutal weather. James, now in his early 50s, moved a bit slower than he had in his youth, but he was still strong and capable. He had trained Ben to take over most of the physical ranch work, and he now focused on the business side, on breeding decisions and market strategies. But he still rode out every morning to check on the herd, still spent time with his horses, still found satisfaction in physical labor. One evening in 1910, sitting on their porch as they had done thousands of times before, Sarah asked James if he had any regrets. "About what?" he said. "About everything. About choosing me over someone easier, about building a life that required so much work. About tying yourself to a woman who could predict storms but could not stop them." James was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I regret that I did not kiss you sooner," he finally said. "I wasted months being careful and proper when I could have been loving you. That is my only regret." Sarah laughed, but there were tears in her eyes. 27 years, she said. We have been married 27 years. I have known you for 30. How is it possible that I love you more now than I did at the beginning? Because love is not a fixed thing. It grows, it deepens. It becomes part of who you are. James reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers in a gesture that was habit and choice both. You are the best decision I ever made, Sarah Holloway. Trusting your word, believing in your gift, loving you with everything I had, those were the smartest things I ever did. They sat together as the stars emerged, holding hands, comfortable in silence, two people who had built a life worth living. In 1912, Rose graduated from veterinary school and returned to Kansas, opening a practice in Abilene that served both farm animals and household pets. She was the first female veterinarian in the state, and while some farmers refused to hire her because of her gender, most quickly learned that her skill exceeded her male competitors. Within 2 years, her practice was thriving, and she was being consulted on difficult cases throughout the region. Sarah continued her weather work, now in her 50s, a respected elder stateswoman of meteorology. Young scientists came to study with her, to learn her methods, to understand how she processed information that instruments could not measure. She was generous with her knowledge, teaching anyone who genuinely wanted to learn, hoping to create a next generation of forecasters who could combine traditional scientific methods with human sensitivity. The ranch remained the center of their lives. Ben and Catherine had 4 children now, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, and the property rang with young voices. Sarah loved being a grandmother, loved watching her grandchildren grow, loved seeing pieces of herself and James reflected in these new people. She taught them to read weather signs, to understand the sky, to trust their instincts. Not all of them had her gift, but all of them learned to respect it. In the spring of 1915, Sarah predicted what would become known as the Easter Sunday tornado outbreak, a series of violent tornadoes that tore across Oklahoma and Kansas. She issued warnings 2 weeks in advance, providing specific dates and times and projected paths with unprecedented accuracy. Towns along the predicted routes implemented emergency protocols. People prepared shelters, secured property, arranged to evacuate vulnerable areas. When the tornadoes came on April 4th, exactly as Sarah predicted, the death toll was a fraction of what it would have been without warning. In the aftermath, the Weather Bureau officially acknowledged her contributions and incorporated her techniques into their training programs. It was the culmination of 30 years of work, the validation Sarah had never sought but appreciated nonetheless. She was now 54 years old, a grandmother, a famous forecaster, a woman who had changed how an entire nation thought about weather prediction. But when reporters asked her about her legacy, she always gave the same answer. My legacy is my family. The lives I helped save matter, but the life I built with my husband and children matters more. Everything else is secondary to that. James, listening to her say this for perhaps the 100th time, smiled, because he knew it was true. Despite the fame, despite the historical importance of her work, Sarah had never lost sight of what mattered most. She had remained grounded, connected to the land and the people she loved, never letting success or recognition change who she was at her core. In the summer of 1918, as the world was ending its involvement in the Great War and dealing with the Spanish flu pandemic, Sarah fell ill. It started as a summer cold, nothing serious, but it progressed to pneumonia, and suddenly this woman who had survived tornadoes and droughts and every challenge the sky could throw at her was fighting for her life in her own bed. James never left her side, sleeping in a chair next to her, refusing to eat unless she ate, his fear a palpable thing that filled the house. Ben and Rose both came home, bringing their families, gathering around their mother. Dr. Hayes traveled from Lawrence, bringing medicine and grim predictions about survival rates. For a week, Sarah's fever raged, and James held her hand and prayed to a God he had never been particularly close to. bargaining and pleading and promising anything if only she would live. On the 8th day, the fever broke. Sarah opened her eyes, clear and cognizant for the first time in days, and found James's face inches from hers, haggard with worry and lack of sleep. "You look terrible," she whispered, her voice rough. James laughed, and it sounded like sobbing. "You nearly died. You do not get to criticize my appearance. I am not dying. I have too much work left to do, too many predictions to make, too many years to spend with you." She lifted a weak hand to his face. "I am not leaving you, James, not yet. We still have time," and they did. Sarah recovered slowly, regaining strength over months, and by the end of 1918, she was back to making weather predictions, though she tired more easily than before and took more time for rest. The illness had reminded them both of mortality, of the fact that their time, however precious, was limited. They made different choices after that, delegating more of the ranch work to Ben, spending more time together, traveling to places they had always wanted to see. They went to San Francisco in 1920 and saw the Pacific Ocean for the first time. They traveled to New York City in 1922 and experienced the overwhelming energy of that massive metropolis. They visited Tennessee in 1923, finding the place where James had grown up, standing in the overgrown ruins of his family's farm and making peace with his past. Everywhere they went, Sarah made weather predictions, and James stood beside her, proud and protective, her partner in all things. As the 1920s progressed, and the country entered a period of prosperity and modernization, the Holloway Ranch remained a constant, a piece of the Old West preserved into the new era. They had electricity now, and indoor plumbing, and a telephone that rang constantly with requests for Sarah's forecasts. But they still raised cattle, still bred horses, still worked the land that had been in Sarah's family for 3 generations. In 1925, Sarah was 64 and James was 68. They were grandparents many times over, their children and grandchildren spreading across Kansas and beyond, carrying forward the values and work ethic they had instilled. Rose's veterinary practice had expanded to include 2 partners and a large clinic. Ben's horse breeding operation was known throughout the West. The Holloway name meant something in Kansas, meant quality and integrity and reliability. One evening in late spring, sitting on their porch as they had done for more than 40 years, Sarah turned to James with a serious expression. "There is a storm coming," she said, "but not the kind I usually predict." James looked at her, concerned. "What do you mean?" "I mean I can feel something changing in my body. The same way I feel weather systems, I can feel this. Something fundamental is shifting." She took his hand. "I do not think I have many years left, James. Maybe 5, maybe 10 if I am lucky, but I can feel time running out." James's face went pale. "Do not say that. Do not predict your own death." "I am not predicting it. I am just acknowledging what I feel, and I want you to know that every single day I have had with you has been a gift. Every morning I woke up beside you, every storm we weathered together, every time you trusted my word when no one else would, those are the moments that made my life meaningful." Tears streamed down her face, but her voice stayed steady. "You saved me, James, not from the tornado, but from loneliness. From doubt. From spending my life being something I was not. You let me be exactly who I was meant to be, and you loved me for it. I cannot imagine a better life than the one we built together." James pulled her into his arms, holding her with a desperation that spoke of his fear of losing her. "You are my everything," he said, his voice breaking. "You have been my everything since the day I met you. I do not know how to be in this world without you." "You will endure," Sarah said, "because you are strong, because our children and grandchildren need you. Because the work continues even after we are gone. But I hope you will remember that loving you was the greatest privilege of my life." They held each other as the sun set, as the stars emerged, as the night deepened around them. And in the years that followed, they made the most of every moment, treating each day as the gift it was, loving each other with the intensity of people who knew their time was finite. Sarah's prediction about herself proved accurate. In 1930, at the age of 69, she fell ill again, this time with something the doctors could not quite diagnose, some failure of systems that medicine could not repair. She spent her final weeks in the bedroom she had shared with James for 47 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren, holding court from her bed, still making weather predictions even as her body failed. "There will be a drought," she told Ben 3 days before she died. "Starting next year, it will last most of the decade. Tell the farmers to prepare. Tell them to plant drought-resistant crops, to conserve water, to expect hardship. Promise me you will tell them." Ben, tears streaming down his face, promised. On a clear June morning, with James holding her hand and all her family gathered around, Sarah Holloway took her last breath. She died as she had lived, with dignity and grace, surrounded by love, secure in the knowledge that her life had mattered. The funeral was the largest Abilene had ever seen. Farmers came from 3 states, ranchers who had trusted her predictions for decades, scientists who had studied her methods, government officials who had relied on her expertise. They buried her beside her father in the family plot on the ranch, under a sky she had spent her lifetime understanding. James stood at her graveside, his face carved from stone, and read from a statement he had written. Sarah Holloway predicted weather better than any almanac ever published. She saved countless lives with her gift, but she was more than her abilities. She was a partner, a mother, a grandmother, a friend. She was the bravest person I ever knew, willing to trust herself when the whole world doubted her. She was my wife for 47 years, and loving her was the honor of my lifetime. The storms will keep coming, but the world will be darker without her light to guide us through them. The drought Sarah predicted began in 1931, exactly as she said it would. It lasted through the 1930s, creating the Dust Bowl, devastating farms and families across the Great Plains. But because of her warning, some people had prepared. Some had saved seed, had stored resources, had made plans that allowed them to survive what others could not. Even in death, Sarah's final prediction saved lives. James lived another 8 years after Sarah died, managing the ranch with Ben, spending time with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, carrying on because Sarah had asked him to. But everyone who knew him said he was never quite the same after she passed, that some essential light had gone out of him. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1938, at age 81, and they buried him beside Sarah under the Kansas sky they had both loved. Their story became legend in Kansas and beyond. Books were written about the woman who could predict weather, about the cowboy who trusted her word over all others, about the partnership that changed meteorology and saved thousands of lives. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through generations, and on the hill where the house stood, there was a monument to Sarah and James, a simple stone marker that read, "She knew the storms, he believed her, together they built something lasting." Ben kept his promise to his mother. He spread her warning about the drought, helped organize relief efforts, used the credibility she had built over decades to convince people to take precautions. Rose continued her veterinary practice, becoming one of the most respected animal doctors in the Midwest, honoring her mother by being excellent at what she did. Their children and grandchildren carried forward the lessons they had learned, about trusting your gifts, about partnership, about love that endures beyond death. Sarah's methods were eventually incorporated fully into the Weather Bureau's training programs. The concept of human sensitivity to atmospheric changes, once dismissed as impossible, became accepted science. Women interested in meteorology pointed to Sarah Holloway as proof that gender had nothing to do with capability. She became a symbol, an inspiration, a pioneer whose work opened doors for others. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the love story itself. In a harsh time and a brutal place, a woman with an impossible gift and a man who believed in her built something beautiful. They proved that partnership could be equal, that love could deepen rather than fade, that two people working together could weather any storm. They showed that trusting someone completely, believing in them when everyone else doubted, was an act of courage and an investment that paid dividends for a lifetime. The ranch still stands today, operated by the sixth generation of Holloways. The weather station Sarah established still functions, upgraded with modern technology but fundamentally unchanged in purpose. And on clear Kansas evenings when the wind blows just right, people swear they can feel something in the air, some presence that understands the sky, some echo of a woman who could predict weather better than any almanac published, and a cowboy who trusted her word over all. Their story reminds us that gifts are meant to be used, that love is meant to be lived fully, that partnership between equals can change the world. Sarah and James Holloway were extraordinary people who chose each other, believed in each other, and built a legacy that lasted far beyond their years. They faced storms literal and metaphorical, and they emerged victorious because they faced them together. That is the heart of their story, the core truth that makes it worth remembering. Love that trusts completely, partnership that holds steady, and two people who looked at the sky and saw the future, then built that future together with their own hands and hearts.